My father's grip on my collar was ironclad, his fingers digging into the fabric of my shirt, nearly choking me as he dragged me forward. His eyes, once filled with warmth and guidance, burned with a fury I had never seen before. His face was twisted with rage, the veins in his neck pulsing as if his anger alone could set the world ablaze. "You're dead to us." His voice thundered through the house, shaking the very walls that had once sheltered me. I barely had time to register what was happening before he shoved me forward with all his strength. My body stumbled, hitting the floor with a thud. The air in my lungs burst out in a gasp, but that was the least of my worries. The heat was instant, searing. Flames roared around me, licking at the wooden beams, devouring everything in their path. Smoke curled in thick, choking clouds, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. The acrid stench of burning fabric and wood stung my nostrils, making my eyes water. My chest clenched as I struggled to draw a clean breath, but every inhale was poisoned by the thick, deadly air. Through the suffocating haze, I heard my mother's voice, calm, cold, and final. "It's better this way." Something inside me shattered. I turned toward the door just in time to see it slam shut. The lock clicked into place. They were sealing my fate. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the floor, struggling to rise. My mind screamed at me to move, to act, but my body was frozen in shock. The heat was unbearable, sweat pooling on my skin, making my clothes stick to me as the fire grew. I could feel it now, truly feel it, the unbearable scorch of flames creeping closer, greedily reaching for me. My own family had sentenced me to die. Panic surged through me like ice water through my veins, a sharp contrast to the inferno that threatened to consume me. No, I wouldn't die here. I refused to let them win. I spun, my eyes scanning frantically through the smoke, searching for an escape. The windows, shrouded in thick, curling flames, were my only chance. But the heat, the glass, could I make it? A sharp crack splintered the air as a wooden beam collapsed, crashing to the floor mere inches from where I stood. Sparks burst upward, embers flying through the air like fireflies in a deathly dance. I recoiled, coughing violently, my lungs screaming for oxygen. The fire was greedy, but I was desperate. I staggered toward the window, my vision blurred from smoke and tears. Every breath burned my throat, and my limbs felt like lead. But I had to move. The window loomed before me, my salvation and my torment. My reflection, distorted by the flickering flames, stared back at me with wide, terrified eyes. There was no time to hesitate. I drew back my fist, muscles tensed. Then, with every ounce of strength I had left, I drove my hand forward. Glass shattered. Shards sliced through my skin like razors, blood welling up instantly. The pain barely registered. A gust of cold night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat behind me. It was now or never. I didn't think. I just leaped. The jagged edges of the window frame tore at my arms as I propelled myself through. For a brief, weightless moment I was airborne, surrounded by darkness and smoke. Then gravity took hold and I plummeted. I crashed onto the ground outside, rolling as pain shot through my limbs. The impact jarred every bone in my body, but I was alive. I gasped for breath, the fresh night air flooding my lungs. Burning, bleeding, but alive. Behind me, the fire raged, devouring the house I once called home. The windows glowed like molten gold, the flames licking higher into the sky, turning the night into a hellish inferno. I forced myself onto my knees, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the cold earth. I felt the sting of glass embedded in my flesh, the slow trickle of blood sliding down my fingers. My body screamed in protest, but my mind was somewhere else. I had survived. They had tried to kill me, and I had survived. A bitter, broken laugh clawed its way out of my throat, barely more than a rasp. I had no home now, no family, no name. I didn't look back. I never would. The night was colder than I had expected, the icy air biting at my exposed skin. My hands shook uncontrollably, not from the cold but from the intensity of what had just happened. I could still smell the smoke in my clothes, the acrid scent of burning wood and memories seared into my senses. The fire had consumed everything: my family, my home, and any remnants of the life I once knew. There was nothing left for me there. I didn't stop to think. I couldn't afford to. As the adrenaline still pulsed through my veins, I forced my body to move. I staggered through the dark streets, my legs unsteady, my mind foggy from the smoke. The city was quiet, eerily so. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I found myself standing in front of a small alley, shadows swallowing the corners of the narrow path. My stomach growled, reminding me of the hunger gnawing at my insides. I hadn't eaten in hours. The world around me was silent, but my senses were on high alert. A small flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned sharply to see a man watching me from the end of the alley. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but the way his eyes tracked me told me he wasn't just another passerby. Something about him felt different, dangerous, and yet there was something familiar in the way he carried himself. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Every instinct told me to run, to keep moving. But my feet wouldn't budge. The man took a step forward, the heel of his boot clicking against the pavement. "You're bleeding." I glanced down at my hands, the blood from the glass still staining my skin. I hadn't noticed until now. The sharp sting from the wounds reminded me of the pain, but it wasn't the pain that worried me. It was the realization that I was vulnerable. That my escape had only just begun, and it wasn't over yet. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. The man chuckled softly, as if amused by my silence. "Not much of a talker, are you?" His voice was low, measured, and yet it held a certain weight to it, a promise, maybe, or a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you." I didn't believe him. But I didn't move either. The world had already betrayed me once. What was one more person trying to take advantage of me? "Come with me," he said, his tone soft, almost coaxing. "You'll want to, sooner or later." I took a step back, every nerve in my body on high alert. The streetlights flickered above us, casting long shadows over the alley as I weighed my options. I could keep walking, keep running, keep trying to survive on my own. Or I could trust him, or at least take the chance to see what this man wanted from me. He didn't seem to be in any hurry, just watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You've been through something, haven't you?" he asked. "Something big." I didn't answer him. It wasn't just the pain or the blood, it was the gnawing sense of betrayal, the feeling that I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Not even myself. "You don't have to trust me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But if you want to survive this city, you're going to need help." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and for the first time since I had run from that burning house, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had been alone for hours, wandering the streets with no plan, no safety net. Everything had been taken from me in one cruel stroke, and yet, here was a man offering me, what? Help? Protection? I had nothing left to lose. "Fine," I said, the word barely a whisper. He nodded, as if expecting this answer. "Good choice," he said with a slight smile. "Follow me." He turned and began walking deeper into the alley. I hesitated for a second, my eyes darting around the empty streets, before I followed. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. But something inside me told me that this was my only chance. The alley opened up to a much larger street, and we walked in silence for several blocks. I stayed a few paces behind him, still unsure of what I was walking into. My mind raced as I tried to process everything that had happened. My family's betrayal. The fire. The escape. The man in front of me. Was this my new reality now? Eventually, we stopped outside a nondescript building, one of many that lined the street. It wasn't much to look at, the windows dark and the walls unremarkable, but there was something about it that felt different. A subtle energy, like it was a place for those who didn't belong anywhere else. He turned to me, studying me with that same intensity. "This is where you'll stay for now. You're safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign on my tongue. Safe? Could I ever feel safe again? Could I trust anyone? He must have seen the doubt in my eyes. "You're not alone here," he said. "There's a whole network of people, all trying to survive." I'm not offering you comfort or a family, but I can teach you how to stand on your own 2 feet again. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what he meant. Teach me? What could he possibly teach me? I had already survived the worst thing that had ever happened to me. But I followed him inside, into the unknown. The building's interior was dark, and the air smelled of dust and stale coffee. It was a stark contrast to the world outside, and I immediately felt the tension in my shoulders begin to loosen. Maybe it was because I wasn't alone anymore, or maybe because I was surrounded by people who, for better or worse, knew what it meant to survive. The man led me through a narrow hallway to a small, dimly lit room at the end. Get some rest, he said, motioning to the bed in the corner. You'll need it. We'll talk tomorrow. I didn't argue. I had no strength left to do anything but obey. I walked to the bed, the sheets rough beneath my fingertips, and collapsed onto it. The pain in my body, the exhaustion from everything that had happened, finally took its toll. My eyes closed, and for the first time since the fire, I let sleep take me. But even as I drifted off, I knew one thing for sure. This escape, this night, had changed everything. I woke up to the sound of distant sirens, their wailing cries echoing through the city streets like a morning song. The dim light filtering through the dirty window told me that morning had arrived, but there was no warmth in it. Just another cold, gray day. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was. The rough texture of the blanket against my skin, the unfamiliar scent of dust and stale air, it didn't belong to me. Nothing did anymore. Then it all came rushing back. The fire, the betrayal, the escape. I sat up slowly, my muscles aching from exhaustion and injury. My hands were still wrapped in makeshift bandages from the cuts I'd sustained breaking through the window. The pain was dull now, numbed by the sheer weight of everything else pressing down on me. The man who had brought me here, whoever he was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. I pushed myself up and staggered to my feet. My stomach ached with hunger, a sharp reminder that I had nothing to my name, not food, not money, not even an identity anymore. I was a ghost, an afterthought in a city that wouldn't even blink if I disappeared. I couldn't stay here. The streets outside were alive with motion. Cars sped past, pedestrians bustled along the sidewalks, their faces buried in their own lives. No one looked at me. No one cared. I blended into the background, just another shadow in a place filled with them. I walked aimlessly at first, my body running on instinct. The city had its own rhythm, and I had to learn to move with it if I wanted to survive. The first rule of the streets: find food. Hunger gnawed at my insides like a feral animal demanding attention. I found myself drifting toward a marketplace, a busy stretch of street lined with stalls and vendors shouting their prices. The smell of fresh bread and roasted meat filled the air, making my stomach twist with need. I had no money, but desperation was a powerful motivator. I lingered near a fruit stand, watching as customers came and went. The vendor, an older man with a lined face, was busy haggling with a woman over a handful of oranges. His attention flickered for just a second, and that was all I needed. I moved fast, my hand darting forward to snatch an apple from the pile. My heart slammed against my ribs as I tucked it into my jacket and turned away. 1 step. 2. 3. Hey. My stomach dropped. The vendor's voice was sharp, cutting through the noise of the market. I didn't wait to see if he had seen my face. I ran. The crowd parted as I bolted through them, my breath coming in short gasps. I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I twisted through narrow alleys, vaulted over a low fence, and didn't stop until my legs threatened to give out. When I finally slowed, I found myself in an abandoned lot, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. My heart was still hammering, but the apple was still in my hands. I sank to the ground and bit into it, the taste of stolen fruit the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. This was my life now. Nights were the hardest. Without a roof over my head, every evening was a battle against the cold and the unknown. I found shelter where I could, under bridges, in the back rooms of old buildings, anywhere that kept me hidden from prying eyes. The city had its own set of dangers, and I learned them quickly. The second rule of the streets: trust no one. Desperation made people unpredictable. I saw it in their eyes, the same hunger that gnawed at my own ribs. There were others like me, kids with nowhere to go, but that didn't make them allies. Everyone was looking for an edge, a way to survive. I learned to sleep lightly, to keep my back to a wall, to never stay in one place too long. One night, I found an abandoned apartment building with a broken door. The floors were covered in dust, the air stale, but it was shelter. I curled up in a corner, my arms wrapped around myself for warmth, and tried to sleep. That was when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. My pulse spiked. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, barely breathing. A figure stepped into the faint moonlight spilling through a broken window. A boy, maybe a little older than me, his clothes tattered, but his posture confident. He looked like he had been here before. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. I tensed. "New here?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. I didn't answer. He sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "Relax. I'm not gonna rob you." That didn't mean I trusted him. He leaned against the wall, watching me with something that almost looked like amusement. "Let me guess. You're fresh to the streets, aren't you?" I said nothing. He smirked. "You'll learn fast. Or you won't last long." I didn't need his advice. I stood up, ready to leave, but he held up a hand. "Look, I don't care what your story is. But if you're planning on surviving out here, you need to learn the rules." I hesitated. He took that as permission to continue. "Rule number 1. Never let them see you're weak. If they think you're easy prey, you're done." I clenched my fists. I wasn't weak. Rule number 2. Don't get comfortable. The second you think you're safe, you're not. I already knew that. Rule number 3. He paused, looking at me like he was trying to decide if I was worth the effort. Find something to fight for. Otherwise, you'll disappear just like the rest. Something to fight for. I had nothing left. But I had something to prove. I met his gaze, the fire in my chest burning hotter than the one that tried to kill me. I wasn't going to disappear. I was going to make them regret ever casting me out. I wasn't just surviving. I was planning my return. The city never slept. Neither did I. Nights bled into mornings, the hunger in my gut a constant reminder that I had nothing, not a home, not a family, not even a name worth saying out loud. The streets had become my hunting ground, a place where I learned to move unseen, to take what I needed without hesitation. But survival wasn't enough. Every night, as I lay in the shadows of abandoned buildings or curled up beneath rusted fire escapes, I thought of them. My father, his voice dripping with venom as he threw me to my death. My mother, her final words as cold as ice. They had tried to erase me, to burn me out of existence. I wasn't dead. I was sharpening myself into something they would never see coming. But rage alone wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed power. And power didn't come from sleeping in alleyways. It came from knowing the right people. I met him on a night when the city was alive with neon lights and the distant hum of sirens. I had been watching from the rooftops, scanning the streets below for a mark, someone careless enough to make my night a little easier. That was when I saw him. A man in a dark coat, standing on the corner of a dimly lit street, speaking to someone who shouldn't have been afraid. But they were. A well-dressed businessman, the kind who walked with his nose in the air, cowering under the weight of the man's gaze. I didn't hear their conversation, but I saw the exchange. A briefcase handed over, a nod of understanding, and the businessman all but fleeing into the night. That man in the coat wasn't just someone. He was someone important. I don't know why I followed him. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was stupidity. But something in me knew that this man had answers, and I needed them. I trailed him from the rooftops, moving like a shadow as he disappeared into the backstreets. He walked with confidence, like a man who had nothing to fear. I should have seen it coming. The moment I dropped down into an alley to follow him, he was already there, waiting in the darkness. "Brave," he murmured, his voice smooth as steel sliding from its sheath. Or stupid. I didn't move. Didn't speak. His eyes glinted under the dim glow of the street lamp. "I don't like being followed, kid." I forced my voice to stay even. I want to learn. Something flickered across his face, amusement, maybe, or mild curiosity. He stepped closer, and for the first time, I felt it, the presence of someone who held real power. Not money, not status. Control. And control was what I needed. He studied me, his gaze sweeping over my ragged clothes, the bruises on my skin, the way I held myself, like a wolf pretending to be a stray dog. "What do you think I can teach you?" he asked. I met his gaze without hesitation. How to win. Silence stretched between us, thick as the tension of a held breath. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A low, quiet sound, like he had just heard a joke no one else understood. "You're either insane," he said, shaking his head, "or you're exactly what I've been looking for." I didn't ask what he meant. I just waited. He exhaled slowly, as if making a decision. Then he nodded. "Fine. I'll give you one shot. But if you waste my time," he leaned in, his voice dropping to something dark and absolute. "I'll end you myself." I didn't flinch. Deal. He studied me for another moment before he turned, motioning for me to follow. I had no idea what I was stepping into. But I didn't hesitate. The underground world wasn't like the streets above. It had its own rules, its own hierarchy. And if you didn't know how to play, you didn't last long. The man, who I later learned was called Vance, didn't waste time with explanations. He threw me into the deep end. Fights. Hustles. Negotiations in dimly lit backrooms where the wrong word could get you buried. At first, I was nothing more than an errand boy, running messages between people who spoke in riddles and threats. But I watched. I learned. Pain is a debt. Make them pay it back. Vance's words were sharp as a blade, cutting away any illusions I had left about fairness or morality. This world wasn't about who was right. It was about who was left standing. And I had no intention of falling. He taught me how to read people, how to see through their lies, how to make them afraid instead of the other way around. How to take power instead of waiting for someone to give it to me. "You want revenge?" he asked me one night, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Then stop acting like a victim. The world doesn't owe you justice. You take it." I clenched my fists. I had no illusions about what that meant. But I was ready. I trained harder than anyone. Fought harder. Listened when others ignored the small details that meant the difference between winning and losing. I learned that the most dangerous people weren't the ones who shouted the loudest. They were the ones who waited. Who watched. Who struck only when it mattered most. And when I was finally ready, Vance took me to the next level. "You've been in the dirt too long," he said. "It's time you learn how the world really works." And so I climbed. From the alleys to the back rooms. From running errands to running the game. I wasn't just some street kid anymore. I was rising. And one day soon, the people who had thrown me away would realize their mistake. They thought they had killed me. They had only created something far, far worse. Power was never given. It was taken. Vance drilled that into me every day, every night, in every lesson that left me bruised, bloody, and stronger than before. He didn't teach with kindness. There was no room for that in his world. There was only survival, control, and the cold, sharp precision of knowing when to strike and when to wait. "You want to climb?" he asked one evening, watching me as I finished rapping my knuckles after yet another underground fight. "Then you stop thinking like a survivor and start thinking like a player." I met his gaze, breathing hard but unbroken. "Teach me." A slow smile curved his lips. "That's what I like to hear." And so, my real education began. It started small. Hustles. Deals. Learning the game from the bottom rung. I became the kid who could get things done. People came to me when they needed something. Money moved, problems solved, people handled. I watched how power worked, not just in the underground, but in the real world. The real power wasn't in back alley fights or street deals. It was in business. Vance introduced me to men who never got their hands dirty, but they controlled everything. Bankers, politicians, business moguls who smiled in public while crushing their enemies behind closed doors. "This is where real power lies," Vance told me as we stood in a high-rise overlooking the city. "Not in fists. not in guns. In ownership. I watched the skyline that night and made my decision. I wouldn't just survive. I would own everything. It took years. Years of clawing my way up from nothing, learning every trick, every weakness, every flaw in the system. I started investing not just in money, but in people. I built my own network. Brokers, lawyers, enforcers. I made sure that anyone who owed me understood that their debt was never forgotten. I bought into real estate, then businesses, then banks. Quietly, methodically. Every move was calculated. Every investment was a step toward the endgame. I didn't care about fast money. I cared about control. And the higher I climbed, the more I realized how fragile those above me truly were. The so-called powerful were weak. Tied down by their greed, their arrogance, their belief that they were untouchable. I proved them wrong. One by one, I took their assets, their connections, their influence, until I became the one they answered to. I still remember the first time a man who once looked down on me sat across from me at a negotiation table. He was older, wealthier, and, when I had first come into this world, untouchable. Now? His hands trembled as he reached for his glass of whiskey, trying to hide his nerves. I leaned back in my chair, watching him with the same calculating look Vance had once given me. "You know who I am," I said smoothly. He swallowed hard. Nodded. "Good," I continued. "Then you know why we're having this conversation." His fingers tightened around the glass. "It's just business." I cut him off with a quiet chuckle. "No, this is business." I slid a folder across the table. "Everything you own? It's mine now." He hesitated, eyes darting over the papers inside. Realization dawned. His mouth opened. Closed. I saw it in his eyes the moment he understood that he had already lost. That I had taken everything from him, just like he had done to others for years. He had thought himself safe, protected, but he had never seen me coming. And when he finally signed the papers, surrendering everything he had built, I felt nothing but satisfaction. This wasn't about money. It was about power. Vance was right. I stopped thinking like a survivor. I started thinking like a king. And kings? They ruled. I owned buildings, banks, clubs. Politicians whispered my name in meetings behind closed doors, wondering whether they needed me or feared me. Either way, I had won. I had become untouchable. But there was still one last thing left to take. Them. The people who had tried to burn me out of existence. The ones who had thrown me away like I was nothing. I had spent years preparing, watching, waiting, and now? Now it was their turn to lose everything. The call came late at night. I had been expecting it. For years, I had waited for this moment, building, acquiring, watching as the cracks in their world deepened, as their foundation crumbled beneath them. It had started slowly. A failed investment. A miscalculation. A loan that couldn't be repaid. Then it snowballed. One bad deal led to another. Their business faltered, debts piled up, and soon, the family that had once stood at the pinnacle of power found themselves drowning. I had made sure of it. And now, here we were. The phone buzzed against my desk, vibrating like the heartbeat of a dying man. I let it ring twice before answering, lifting it slowly to my ear. Silence. Then a breath. And then, the voice I had not heard in years. "My father. We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, gazing out over the city skyline. The view from my penthouse was nothing like the one I had grown up with. There was no warmth in this place, no memory of home, only glass, steel, and the empire I had built with my own hands. The empire they had given me the drive to create when they tried to kill me. I let the silence stretch between us, savoring the moment. Finally, I spoke. About what? A pause. I could hear the tension in his breath, the weight of his pride cracking under the force of desperation. It must have killed him to make this call. "You know what?" he said, his voice hoarse. "We've run into some problems." I smirked. That's one way to put it. Problems? Their company had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Their assets were frozen, their partners had abandoned them, and every attempt to claw their way back had only sunk them deeper into failure. And the best part? I had orchestrated every single piece of it. "You're bankrupt," I said, my tone even. "No money. No influence. No allies." I could almost hear him grinding his teeth. It must have burned him to know that I was the one saying this to him now. "We need help," he admitted after a long moment. I let that sentence sit in the air. We need help. So simple. So pathetic. Years ago, when I had been left for dead, I had needed help. And what had they done? They had shut the door. They had locked it. They had chosen fire over family. And now? Now they had nowhere to go. I swirled the glass of whiskey in my hand, staring at the amber liquid as if it held the answers to all of life's cruelty. "What happened to all your friends?" I asked, knowing full well the answer. There was a bitter chuckle on the other end of the line. "They turned their backs on us," he admitted. "Just like you turned your back on me." I almost laughed. The irony was so sharp it could cut steel. Silence stretched again, heavier this time. I could imagine him sitting there, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white, hating every second of this conversation, but knowing he had no other choice. "Your mother," he began, then stopped. The words seemed to catch in his throat. I waited. "She's not well," he finally said. "The stress has been too much." So that's how they thought they'd win me over. A sympathy card. A plea for mercy. I should have felt something. Maybe a long time ago I would have. But that part of me was gone. Burned away in the fire they left me in. I leaned forward, my fingers tapping idly against my desk. "And why exactly are you calling me?" Another pause. I could almost hear him swallowing his pride, forcing the words out like they were poison. "We need you," he said. "We need help. We need you." The words hung in the air, a cruel, delicious echo of everything they had denied me before. I could have ended the conversation there. I could have told him no. I could have reminded him of how he had shoved me toward the fire, of how my mother had coldly accepted my death as the easier option. I could have left them to rot. But that wasn't enough. No, they had to come to me. They had to face me. I took a slow sip of my drink, savoring the taste. Then, finally, I answered, "Come find me." I hung up. I could only imagine what they were feeling in that moment. Panic. Humiliation. Fear. For the first time in their lives, they weren't the ones in control. They had spent years at the top, thinking they were untouchable. Thinking that no matter what happened, someone else would catch them before they hit the ground. They never expected that the person waiting at the bottom was me. That night, as I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, overlooking the city that I had conquered, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The betrayal. The fire. The hunger. The years of clawing my way up from nothing, piece by piece, step by step, until I had become something greater than they ever were. And now? Now they were the ones with nowhere to go. They had lost everything. And soon, they would lose even more. Because this wasn't just about revenge. This was about making them understand. They had abandoned me, believing I was nothing. Now, I would show them just how wrong they were. The silence after I hung up was heavier than anything I had ever felt. For a long time, I simply sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, the weight of the moment settling in my chest like a stone. They had finally broken. Years of carefully orchestrated destruction had led to this moment, the call, the pleading tone in my father's voice, the admission of complete and utter failure. I had waited for this. Imagined it. Yet, now that it had happened, I found myself unmoving, caught in the echoes of a past I had buried. I placed the phone down, exhaling slowly. Then I laughed. A quiet, bitter sound, one that carried no humor, only the satisfaction of knowing I had won. They were at their lowest. And I wasn't done yet. I let the message sit unread for days. I didn't need to respond immediately. They needed me, not the other way around. Every hour that passed without an answer would drive them deeper into desperation. And that was exactly where I wanted them. They had spent years watching me suffer. Now it was their turn. By the third day, I checked the voicemail. My father's voice was rough, strained. He wasn't used to begging, and it showed. "We don't have anyone else," he admitted. I know we made mistakes. Mistakes. That's what he called it. Attempting to kill me. locking the door, watching as flames consumed what they thought was my final breath. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. One they made without hesitation. I played the message twice, letting each word sink in. Then, finally, I sent a reply. A simple, 2-word text. Come find me. I imagine their reactions the moment they read it. Relief. Hesitation. Fear. Because they knew. This wasn't a reunion. This was a reckoning. They had expected me to die. Instead, I had risen from the ashes they left me in, stronger than they could ever comprehend. And now, they had to walk into the very den of the monster they had created. It was poetic, really. I gave them no address, no meeting time, no further instructions. If they truly wanted to find me, they would have to crawl through the ruins of their former life, search the city they once ruled, beg the very people they had looked down on for help. And when they finally arrived at my doorstep, exhausted, desperate, ruined, I would be waiting. The knock came on a cold evening. A slow, hesitant sound. I already knew who it was before I even checked the security feed. I let them wait outside for a full minute. Just long enough to remind them who held the power now. Then, I pressed the button, unlocking the front gate. The heavy iron doors groaned open, revealing the long, winding driveway that led to the estate. They hesitated. Then, step by step, they made their way toward me. I stood at the entrance, arms crossed, watching as they approached. My father looked older. The weight of failure had settled into the lines of his face, deepening the creases around his mouth and eyes. His once sharp, commanding presence was gone, replaced with something hollow. My mother was thinner than I remembered. Her once perfectly kept hair was streaked with gray, her clothes no longer pristine but worn, a shadow of the woman who had once looked at me as if I was an inconvenience. They stopped a few feet from me. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then, finally, my father cleared his throat. You look different. I raised an eyebrow. And you look like a man who's lost everything. His jaw tensed. He didn't deny it. My mother spoke next, her voice quieter than I remembered. We just want to talk. I let the silence stretch. Then, finally, I stepped aside. Then talk. Inside, the air was thick with tension. I led them into the grand sitting room, a space so vast it seemed to mock their presence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the very empire I had built with my own hands. They sat, hesitant, on the expensive leather couch. I remained standing. My father exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together, as if searching for the right words. We made mistakes, he started. I tilted my head, expression unreadable. Define mistakes. A flicker of frustration passed over his face before he smothered it. He wasn't used to being in this position. We thought we were doing what was necessary, he said, voice forced. At the time, we believed. I laughed. Sharp. Cold. You believed, I cut in. You believed that I was expendable. Neither of them denied it. That was the worst part. They had accepted it, justified it. And now that they had lost, they wanted to pretend it was just a mistake? I walked toward them slowly, each step deliberate. I waited years for this moment, I said quietly. Years of surviving. Years of building something greater than you ever could. I stopped just in front of them, looking down at the people who had once towered over me. But tell me, I continued, voice even, why should I help you now? Silence. Then, my mother whispered, because we're your family. I froze. For a second, just a second, I felt something flicker deep inside me. Then, I shoved it down. Family. That word meant nothing coming from them. I leaned forward slightly, meeting their gaze with an expression that sent a shiver down my mother's spine. Family, I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. My father shifted uncomfortably. We know we hurt you. I smiled. Hurt me? I let out a breath, shaking my head. You didn't hurt me. They looked confused. Hopeful, even. Then I leaned in closer. You created me. Their expressions changed. The truth settled in their eyes, the realization that the son they had thrown away was no longer the weak, desperate boy they had abandoned. I was something else now. Something far more dangerous. I pulled back, exhaling slowly. Then, I reached for my glass of whiskey, swirling the liquid lazily. You wanted to talk, I said. So talk. My father straightened, trying to find whatever scraps of dignity he had left. We need your help, he admitted. We lost everything. We have nowhere else to go. I watched him for a long moment. Then, finally, I spoke. Good. His face paled. Good. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the silence stretch. Then, I placed the glass down and smiled. Now you finally understand how it feels. They sat across from me in my mansion, two figures who had once towered over me in authority, now reduced to nothing more than desperate shadows of their former selves. My father's once powerful hands trembled against the expensive fabric of his slacks. My mother, always so poised, so pristine, looked brittle, like a gust of wind could shatter her into pieces. I took my time studying them, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, letting the silence stretch between us like a noose tightening ever so slowly. They had come to me, walked through the very gates they had thought I'd never be able to pass through again. And now, they sat in my home, on my furniture, surrounded by the wealth and power that they once believed was reserved only for them. It was poetic, really. You have nowhere else to go, I finally said, my voice smooth, but laced with something sharp beneath the surface. My father's jaw tightened, his pride clearly still alive even after losing everything. We're not asking for much, he forced out. Just, help us get back on our feet. I exhaled a quiet chuckle, resting my elbow on the armrest. And how exactly do you expect me to do that? My mother cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. We know you have resources, she said carefully, her voice thinner than I remembered. Connections. Business ventures. We just need a foothold, something to rebuild from. A foothold. That's what they wanted. Not just money, but a way back in. A chance to climb again. I shook my head slowly, placing my glass down on the mahogany table. And after everything you did to me, after everything I went through because of you, you think I'd just hand that over? My father stiffened. We were wrong, he admitted through clenched teeth. We made mistakes. There's that word again, I mused. Mistakes. I let out a breath, shaking my head. No, you didn't make a mistake. A mistake is forgetting an appointment. A mistake is miscalculating a deal. I leaned forward now, my tone dropping into something cold, something quiet. What you did to me. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. Silence. My mother swallowed hard. My father's eyes darted away. They knew I was right. I could see the unease settling into them. They had spent their whole lives controlling every situation, every person in their orbit. But this? This was a game they no longer knew how to play. I stood, walking toward the window, looking out over the city skyline. My city. You always taught me something about power, I said, more to myself than to them. That it belongs to those willing to do whatever it takes to get it. To keep it. I turned back to them, watching them shrink under my gaze. But you never realized the real lesson, I continued. That power isn't just about having money. It's about control. I stepped closer, my footsteps slow, deliberate. And right now, I control everything, I said softly. Including what happens to you. My father flinched. My mother's breath hitched. It was sinking in now. The reality of their situation. The way the tables had truly turned. I took my time walking back to my chair, sitting down as though I wasn't deciding their fate in this very moment. So, I said, tilting my head slightly. Why should I help you? My father's fingers curled into fists. His whole body was stiff, his pride warring with his desperation. My mother spoke first. Because we're your family. That word again. Family. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. No. You lost that privilege the day you locked the door. I let those words settle, let them truly understand them. Then I leaned back, stretching my arms slightly before nodding toward the door. Go. My father's head snapped up. What? I motioned toward the exit. You can leave now. My mother's breath quickened. But, you came here looking for a second chance, I said, my voice smooth but merciless. You don't get one. My father's face darkened. You think this makes you strong? He asked bitterly. Kicking us when we're already down? I smirked, standing up to face him fully. "No," I said. "What makes me strong is that I survived everything you did to me, and now I get to decide whether you eat or starve." His jaw clenched. And in that moment, I saw it, the full weight of their loss finally settling into his bones. He wasn't angry anymore. He was afraid. Not of what I could do to him physically, but of what I had already done. I had made them powerless, just like they had done to me. I exhaled slowly, glancing at the guard station near the door. "Escort them out." My mother gasped. "No, please." The guards moved forward, gripping my father's arms. He resisted at first, yanking away, but they didn't falter. My mother reached out, desperation in her eyes. "Please, we have nothing." I tilted my head. "Then I guess you understand how I felt." And with that, I turned my back to them. They screamed, pleaded, but I didn't listen. The doors slammed shut behind them. And this time, I was the one who never looked back. The echoes of their screams faded into the vast silence of the mansion. The heavy doors had shut behind them, sealing their fate the same way they had once sealed mine. I stood there for a moment, my back still turned, listening to the last remnants of their pleading voices, muffled by the thick walls that now separated us permanently. Then, I exhaled. Not a sigh of relief, not a breath of regret, just a slow, measured exhale as I let the moment settle over me. This was it. The moment I had waited for. Years of pain. Years of clawing my way out of the abyss they had thrown me into. Years of building, of taking, of becoming something greater than they had ever been. And now? Now, they had nothing. I had watched them crumble, watched as their empire burned, watched as their desperation grew into something almost pathetic. And I had given them the smallest glimmer of hope, only to crush it beneath my heel. That was the real power. Not just winning, but making sure they knew that I had won. I turned away from the door, my footsteps echoing through the grand hall as I moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My city. The skyline stretched before me, a sea of lights and steel, a testament to the empire I had built from nothing. I sipped my whiskey slowly, savoring the burn, savoring the weight of everything I had accomplished. They had tried to kill me, but all they had done was create something far more dangerous. A king born from the ashes of betrayal. Hours passed before my phone buzzed. A message from one of my men. They're gone. I didn't need to ask where. I had left them no choice but to disappear into the same darkness they had once thrown me into. No money. No home. No allies. Just emptiness. For the first time in their lives, they were nothing. And they had only themselves to blame. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of finality settle over me. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. Not the kind that came from a courtroom or the pages of a law book. This was the only kind of justice that mattered. The kind that came with power. The kind that I controlled. And I controlled everything now. I left the mansion late that night, stepping into the cool night air. The streets were alive with the hum of the city, people moving, deals being made, power shifting hands. And all of it, every corner, every deal, every whispered conversation in the shadows, was under my influence. I had taken everything from them, but I wasn't done. Because power wasn't just about taking. It was about maintaining. I walked to my car, my driver standing at attention, waiting for instructions. I slid into the back seat, the leather cool against my skin. "Where to, sir?" I thought about it for a moment, rolling the glass of whiskey in my palm. Then I smirked. Back to work. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.